Good afternoon, students.
Good afternoon.
How was your weekend?
Great.
Wonderful. Shall we bow our heads? Father, we come again and thank you for your goodness, the blessings of each day. As we study today the Reorganization of 1901, I pray for your special blessing. In the name of Jesus, amen. Well, our subject today is taken from Light Bearers, chapter 16, and it has to do with the troubles that led to reorganization. From 1863 until 1901, a period of 38 years, the church grew 20 times. A tremendous amount of growth during that period of time. And so you can see that there would be growing pains. When a child grows, it's wonderful. And when they grow rapidly, we are always pleased. Except we may have to spend more time and money on new clothes than we'd like. But the fact is that there are always growing pains if a child grows very rapidly, and there are growing pains when a church grows very rapidly. In 1863, there were 6 conferences that were close together in New England and Michigan area. And in 1901, there were 57 conferences and 41 missions, a total of 98 scattered across the whole world in every country except China. China would come later. Also from 3,500 members to 78,000, which is well over 20 times. This was the beginnings of an internationalization in which the various countries of the world would not only provide their churches and their members, but the non-American Adventist impact was intensifying, which meant that North America would gradually become smaller compared with the rest of the world fields. I was at the General Conference when we had, I think, a couple of the world fields passed North America in size. Today, North America is much smaller than several of the divisions of the world. Australia was an early one to begin propagating their own missions in the islands around them. There were problems as well during that period of time with Sunday laws. Many Christians saw the Civil War as God's divine chastisement of Americans for having slaves, which they considered to be sinful. Also, during that same time, there was moral corruption. And that moral corruption that urged people to join in demanding that the United States pass a constitutional amendment that would identify it as Christian and identify God. And the corruption of Grant's government soon after Lincoln was killed was a stimulus to them to realize that something moral had to be changed. In 1864, the National Reform Association was formed with the purpose of seeking moral changes, but especially lobbying for a constitutional amendment to declare this nation a Christian nation, as though declaring a nation a Christian would make it Christian. That's about the same as baptizing an infant who has no knowledge of any issues of any kind, and yet baptized, as when baptism is a symbol of transformation that can come only through response to the Holy Spirit. In 1874, when the National Reform Association failed to succeed in getting a constitutional change because of the fact that Congress was very anxious not to do anything that would cause it to become church-state related, they turned immediately then to lobbying for Sunday laws. And the Adventists saw this then naturally as a fulfillment of Revelation 13, a beginning fulfillment of Revelation 13, which would be the precursor to the final conflict and to Christ's coming. As the focus shifted to Sunday laws, these became especially focused upon in the Bible Belt. And in the Bible Belt, the people unabashedly and openly promoted Sunday worship, although in other states they were careful to make it look like that has nothing to do with religion. It's just a family day. So, but the Sunday laws ended up in dividing the country into two groups. Now notice what those groups were. Those who defended morality, which were the Sunday focus, and the defenders of conscience and personal liberty. That placed Adventists on the same side with the liquor dealers, which was not exactly a comfortable situation. But because the liquor dealers were using conscience and religious liberty as a means of opposing what they knew would cut them down. In other words, they recognized that the defenders of morality were also those who were seeking to shut down the liquor businesses. So we found ourselves in a very awkward circumstance. And in California especially, there was a major battle over the Sunday laws and so forth. And in 1882, in the election, Adventists who had normally tended to be Republican, defected from the Republican government party to the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party was opposed to Sunday laws. And as a result, the Democrats in California won and repealed the Sunday laws. So that was a blessing to Seventh-day Adventists. In Iowa, the members were very reluctant to join the prohibition forces because they feared that what would happen is that the Sunday laws would come next. And so only after they were assured there would be no Sunday laws were they willing to place themselves fully into the prohibition forces. So what happened in many states is that there were Sunday laws and persecution was bound to follow. The purpose of a law is to enforce obedience and concurrence to it. And Seventh-day Adventists could not accept the results. So that in Georgia, one of our brothers spent 30 days in jail for refusing to pay fines for having worked in his own farm plowing on Sunday. In Arkansas, there were 5 members of the church arrested, although many, many others, non-Seventh-day Adventists, were allowed to carry on their own businesses during that period of time. Many other Adventists suffered penalties and confinements over the next decade. In fact, there were actually hundreds of Seventh-day Adventists altogether who were penalized by those who were seeking to enforce Sunday sacredness. And the judge told them, he said, the conscience is not above the law. So you do what the law says, don't worry about what your conscience tells you. In 1886, the Pacific Press Publishing Association brought out the American Sentinel, a journal which became quite effective in helping to fight the cause of freedom and religious liberty. In 1888, Senator Blair, Henry Blair, introduced his Sunday Rest Bill in Congress as a means of capping a petition drive by Wilbur Crafts, who was a key Sunday enforcement man at that time, and who had formed the American Sabbath Union to enforce the Sabbath, or Sunday, I should say. The bill was defeated because of its religious language, but Blair brought it back, he edited it, took out the religious elements, and he also introduced an exemption clause and brought it back again. Now at this point, Seventh-day Baptists were willing to agree, all right, that's all right, we have the exemption and so forth. But Seventh-day Adventists said, no, we must have no religious legislation. And A.T. Jones represented our cause in before the congressional committees, and his argument was that any just law does not need exemptions. As he forcefully could, he presented his case and was successful. The Adventist influence generally prevailed. In fact, the Adventists had a strong influence over the results. As a result of this Sunday agitation, we had the development of the National Religious Liberty Association. Besides that, we had the Conference Religious Liberty Associations, and they had their press committees, the purpose of which was to introduce or place in the papers articles and so forth that would favor religious liberty. And it was during this time that the American Sentinel came out, which was a magazine to promote religious liberty. Adventists aroused the public opinion against erosion of the historic doctrine of the separation of church and state. A.T. Jones was very energetic, and he was the key proponent of separation of church and state. But Ellen White was concerned about some of his ideas and his proposals. There were several that Ellen White opposed. The first was that the denomination should not, under any circumstances, claim civil tax exemption for its church or for any institutions. The second was that Adventists could not morally accept gifts from governmental agencies. And this, by the way, number two, had very significant practical results, because the British, I can't remember the term now or the name, but the British Economic Trade Company offered Seventh-day Adventists a large tract of land in Africa. And Jones insisted, no, we can't accept that. Ellen White was not so inclined, and she indicated that the Lord would impress even governments to favor Adventist work and development. And of course, as you know, Nehemiah in the Bible times was largely gifted by the government, by the king, with a lot of help for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Number three, Adventists jailed for Sunday law labor should not work extra hours in place of working on Sabbath while in confinement. In other words, the proposition was that if you're confined, then you refuse to work on Sabbath, and when you do, you'll likely be fined and given further evidence, but not to do the fine. In other words, you just spend more time in jail. Fourth, it was wrong for Adventists, according to Jones, to vote or participate in any way in the political process. Now, Ellen White herself urged the people not to become involved in political parties. However, she said that if there was a necessity, for instance, laws such as prohibition and so forth, they should vote even if it's on Sabbath. So Ellen White disagreed with him in the idea of no voting. Number five, Jones insisted that it was wrong to prevent Adventist employees in denominational institutions from working a full 6 days if that's what they chose. Now, the fact is that this had significant implications which led to the closure of two of our key institutions in Europe. Jones was using the same methods for the whole world field that would be justified here, where we have a constitution that separates the church and the state. That would have been ideal for other countries, but they didn't have that. As it was, that led the members in Europe to decide that 6 days shalt thou labor. It was just as much binding as it is that the seventh day as the Sabbath, then we should use it, keep it holy and use it for worship. In other words, the two elements, they said, were the same. You are just as much required to work 6 days as to rest the seventh. So when the factory laws took place, which forbade Sunday labor, they insisted they must work on Sunday and did so, and as a result, the publishing houses in both Switzerland and England were shut down. By the end of the 19th century, however, the temperance issues changed because the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Association, and other temperance groups withdrew from the Sunday enforcement program. The reason for the WCTU had to do with two people, with three people actually, Dr. and Mrs. Kellogg and S.M.I. Henry, a woman who was the head of the WCTU. And as far as the Kellogg's, Mrs. Kellogg was a key leader in one of the groups, and Dr. and Mrs. Kellogg together influenced them. In our book, it only mentions Dr. and Mrs. Kellogg, but an even more significant factor was that S.M.I. Henry, Samantha something, it's a long word and not necessary to memorize, but she was a woman who had health problems and went to Battle Creek for treatment. As a result of being in Battle Creek Hospital for a period of time, she became a Seventh-day Adventist. And as the leader in the temperance work, she encouraged them no longer to enforce Sunday, to work for Sunday legislation. Now, there were various challenges, including the tendency on the part of Adventists to take extreme positions. We've mentioned Jones, and Jones's influence was felt around the world, and perhaps there would have been an occasion anyway, but Jones had encouraged extreme views. In 1899, President of the General Conference, George Irwin, declared that Adventists are prone to extremes on nearly everything. And conservative Minneapolis resistance was one of the evidences of extremes on the part of conservatives. They took the position that if we accepted the views of Wagner, that we would lose the Sabbath. Well, that was an extreme idea, and certainly it was not true, because the principles that Wagner taught would actually enforce and make Sabbath worship much more significant, which he did with those who accepted the message. Haskell and Daniels agreed that this mentality was a result of a satanic attack to defuse the 1888 message of righteousness by faith and to distract Adventists from the fundamental truths of that message. During this period of time, there were spiritual revivals, but they often led to darkness because they did not continue the spiritual process. So that in Healdsburg and Battle Creek colleges, in both cases, the spiritual revivals were followed by periods of darkness. At Healdsburg, one of the factors that detracted from the spiritual revival was the view of many that we should not receive any offerings, tithes and offerings on the Sabbath. That this was a moral issue, that we should not do it. It's doing business on the Sabbath. In Battle Creek, the issue was competitive sports, which diverted from spirituality. Ellen White, during that period of time, stated that these satanic agencies are at work to neutralize heaven's blessings of grace, which referred, by the way, to the Minneapolis message. So there were many ways in which Satan sought to deprive Adventists of the Minneapolis message, not just causing it to be rejected at the time, but in many other ways. Other extreme positions involved Jones, Wagner, and Prescott. who emphasized prayer for the sick and led out in a program that bordered on faith healing. And some of them were emphasizing that which led eventually to the Holy Flesh movement, which was right just at that time, and that people with gray hair or who were physically deformed could not receive the seal of God. And some members of the Battle Creek College staff actually went so far as to insist that it was wrong to kill insects or snakes or bugs or rodents because they had life. And this was actually a spin-off from Kellogg's view of panentheism, that God is in everything. So that if the bugs have life, well, that's evidence of God in the bugs. These are basically Hindu ideas. Other extremes, at the 1899 General Conference, Wagner insisted that all Adventists who were keepers of God's commandments should also have the gift of prophecy. And of the false prophets, we've already studied Anna Phillips. But in 1884, there was another Anna in Michigan, Anna Garmir, who claimed to be a prophet and claimed that Christ would be coming in October of that year. So October 1884 is now some 130 years past. Jones, Prescott, and Haskell, for some period of time, did believe that Anna Phillips was God's messenger, and we've studied that in Ellen White's counsel regarding it. There were financial problems, very severe financial problems during this time. In 1893, there was a severe depression that hit the U.S., one of the most significant depressions, that the greatest one that had hit the U.S. at that time, and one of the most significant ones. The donations of property, when people had no money and so forth, they often gave gifts of property, but that became a problem because when you take away the legal expenses of managing and the management fees that are required before you can sell a piece of land, for instance, in a depressed market, this made it very difficult for them to dispose of any gifts of property in a way to receive appropriate revenues from it. At the same time, all the offerings were declining, and at that very time that the offerings were declining, the General Conference payroll tripled, so that from 1892 to 1895, the General Conference payroll became 3 times larger. So what did the denomination do? Well, they needed to do something, and they had to meet the expenses by borrowing money. Now, it wasn't hard to borrow money because Adventists, because of the recession, they lost confidence in the banks, and they were putting the money in the General Conference as a means of loans to the General Conference, and they used that as their bank. So that meant that there was plenty of money in the General Conference. But the use of that money was very, very threatening because there was interest involved in that, and the interest was eating up whatever we had as far as any other funds that were coming to us. When the creditors, those members who had placed their money there, needed the money, there was no money to give them because they'd already used that money for operational and for other things. In the meantime, the various conferences were paying their workers with tithe money, which is appropriate. But some conferences had larger amounts of tithe than they needed, and others had insufficient tithes and could only have a skeleton crew to operate the conference. The first move toward a financial budget came when the Sabbath school offerings had dropped off severely. In 1895, the General Conference President, Elder Olson, requested all of his subordinates to estimate very closely the amount of possible income they had reason to believe they would receive and to plan accordingly. Before that, there had been no budgets and no planned. The money was used as it came in. So what we find is that the denomination faced a disaster, a financial disaster. In 1898, the General Conference Treasury reported a balance of $61.20. Now, it's true that $61 was more by far than $61 would be now, but that would be something like, supposing we say instead of $61, it may have been $600. But for the whole General Conference, to have $61.20 cash was pretty dangerous. And at the same time, they owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they were behind in their payment to their staff of over $20,000. So $61 was a pretty serious situation. The next year, in 1899, the Treasury estimated that there was a combined debt on their institutions of $2 million. Now that $2 million was quite a sum then. And can you imagine the depression this would bring for officers of the General Conference, whether the Treasury or the President, to have almost nothing? It's like Mother Hubbard went to her cupboard and found the cupboard was bare. God works, however, in such circumstances. He permits us to face urgent problems, such as economic problems, in order to teach us to trust Him, and also to teach us how to organize and to plan so that we won't become involved in such things. It was said that the church leaders at the headquarters had become a body of twisters and turners to get hold of money to pay these debts. In other words, the General Conference officers had to spend much of their time trying to find little places here and there they could get a little money to keep the program going. Much of this debt was as a result of the building of institutions and developing and adding on and so forth. For instance, the sanitarium, the Review and Herald, the college, the food manufacturing company, the medical school, the orphanage, and the old people's home all were being developed. Developed at a time when there was no money to develop it, and therefore this resulted in huge indebtedness. Ellen White's comment was that the characters of the leaders needed to be changed, not the institutions. In other words, it was not institutional development that was needed at the time, but character development. And that is often the case. Change was desperately needed at this time. We got two people especially, and that was Kellogg and Henry, were very adept at getting the brethren to pour money into Battle Creek institutions. And as the institutions at Battle Creek were developed, it required more human resources as well. Can you imagine when you develop a significant development of an institution, you are going to have more help, more resources, human resources. And the more human resources that were drawn to Battle Creek, the less they had in the field. And as this problem developed, you had an impoverished field and a growing institutional process within the headquarters, which makes the headquarters predominantly larger and more, having the resources they need and the rest of the field left without. Ellen White's counsel was to disperse, to put institutions all around the world and not have them all concentrated in Battle Creek. Yet Elder Olson, the General Conference president, did not have the strength or the personality to be able to deal with Kellogg and Henry. Now, I think we've talked about Kellogg and his demands for money, and throughout this whole period of time, Kellogg had been very effectively increasing the institutions he was involved with at the expense of the indebtedness of the denomination, and also with the theory that he could borrow money from the denomination and not pay it back because the institutions he was developing were part of the denomination. I might say that eventually he took out of the denomination the Battle Creek hospital and sanitarium, as well as threatening others, threatened actually to take the whole medical work out of the denomination. And Henry, we'll see later on, I think in another program we'll see something about that, but these men were very self-centered and they were very effective. It was Henry was one of the two individuals, especially when Ellen White was sending message after message, no kingly power. Her focus was not on Olson. Olson needed to exercise the authority he had in order to control Henry and one of the other men, and especially to keep them from exercising kingly power. So this unbridled growth prompted those at the headquarters to think of themselves as the hub around which the entire denomination turned, and indeed they were actually making it such. A few men at the center held inordinate power over the development of the entire denomination. The leaders in various other church enterprises came to feel that they could not do anything of significance unless they brought their ideas to the headquarters and had them approved. So you had a cancerous growth at Battle Creek, which was depriving the whole world field of not only material and human resources, but also of the ability to function as they should. The centralization of power, the conflicts within the leadership primarily were between strong personalities such as Kellogg and Henry and other men and the church. At the end of this century, the problems pivoted around philosophy of leadership and pragmatic problems of organization. In other words, it was getting serious enough so that everyone was beginning to say, what are the practical answers? What can we do? The whole denomination was stressed with the big question, what can we do to solve our organizational problems? In 1873, Butler had proposed a very simple solution to leadership, and that is that all leaders should listen to James and Ellen White, and that they were to be the ones who would determine what was to take place. In other words, the responsibility placed upon them. And of course, as a result, Ellen White quickly pointed out the dangers involved when you place one person or two or three persons' judgment as controlling for the whole. James White also wrote a very strong statement opposing this idea. And as a result of Butler's suggestion, there was discussion throughout the world field, and well, I say world field, it was a very small world at that time, United States primarily, but the discussions led to a decision in 1876, a very important discussion, and that was that the highest authority is the will of the body of the people as expressed in the decisions of the General Conference when acting within its proper jurisdiction. And this, by the way, Ellen White's statement of this was when the General Conference was acting in its official capacity in a General Conference session. Such decisions should be submitted to, this is the rest of the decision, by all without exception, unless they can be shown to conflict with the Word of God and the rights of individual conscience. Therefore, the Bible was given a proper place. Notice, the General Conference in session, doesn't mention in session here, but later Ellen White's statement did, in session. Not the General Conference officers, but the General Conference when it meets with the world body in General Conference session is to be submitted to without exception unless it's contrary, they can show that it's contrary to the Bible or conscience. This allowed humans to apply principles and to retain the rights of conscience. It was an excellent decision, and just remember that was 1876. However, it's one thing to pass a resolution, it's another thing to live up to it. The reality did not reach this ideal. If it had to been, the chapters that we're dealing with of the 90s would not be the same as they are by any means, because the problem of kingly power, as we've already discussed, has to do with the heart. And every person has a natural tendency to want to control. And this is what leads to kingly power. Adventist leaders were only, and people could only come together once a year. At that time, general conferences were held once a year. And they were only a short time, and they had to make all kinds of decisions. Therefore, it was not a very effective thing because there were too many things to deal with and too many things that shouldn't be dealt with on a wide scale like that, which had to do with local issues and problems. And during the months, which would be most of the year, when they were not in session, the General Conference Committee and the General Conference President were looked to give leadership and to resolve problems. So that meant that the power was shifted to a very few because the General Conference was relatively small, and then it really placed the burden on the President because even the committee, General Conference Committee, was fragmented because they lived in different parts of the country and they were not able to get together very often. So the result was that the President became more and more autonomous and autocratic in his government. Indeed, he almost had to be because of the manner of organization. I pointed out before that if the authority, if the responsibilities of a given individual are intensified, his authority is increased, and it makes it impossible for him not to become a dictatorial, because there are so many things that have to be decided on, and he's left there with the decisions made. Now, in Europe, they formed a European Missionary Council that discussed these kinds of issues, finances and workers and so forth, and they made some real progress in general principles as to how to resolve the problems and suggested procedures that might have helped to correct the situation at headquarters. Ellen White urged the brethren at the General Conference to counsel together as the Europeans had and to permit the initiative of younger ministers. And the changes did begin. They did do some counseling. A General Conference Executive Committee was increased from 5 to 7. And by the way, the General Conference Committee to begin with was 3 for some time. 3 individuals and the President. Very small group. Had been already changed to 5. Now it's increased to 7. And the General Conference Association was formed. Now you say, what do you mean by association? We have the General Conference Office and we have General Conference Association. Yes, General Conference Association is a different organization than the General Conference. It's a financial organization designed as the financial arm of the denomination to help keep the organization of funding flowing in the proper way. Also, it was voted to have an administrative assistant to the President. Now, I don't know if you know it, but the General Conference President today has a particular assistant. And one of the men who was his assistant recently was a man about 6'7", who I had the privilege of baptizing when he was 16. And I recall having to calculate quite definite where he was to stand in order to be sure his head didn't bang on the cement on the other side. And so it was an interesting baptism. But that was Larry Evans, who's held a number of posts of responsibility. At any rate, 3 other secretaries were added to that, and those were the education, foreign missions, and home missions. Now, those 3, together with the administrative assistant, that in itself it virtually doubled it would even more than double the power or strength of the General Conference, so that it would release the president from a great deal of pressure. However, it still was not enough, and I think we went backward here. There were more structural changes that were needed, and some others that were taking place. In 1888, the North American Division was divided into 4 large districts, and each of those districts was under one of the committee members of the General Conference Executive Committee. And in the next year, they increased that. They redrew the lines to make 6 different regions. That was an important forward step. And they also, at the same time, were wanting to centralize the publishing work, and that placing all of the publishing work under one head of control. Ellen White said, no, that is not the Lord's plan. And as a result, her advice did prevail, and they instead would later on have a districting program that was influenced by the European Council. The Australasian Union Conference was a very important model that developed while Ellen White was in Australia, and Elder Daniels was the president. In order to become more effective, they formed a union of conferences, so that you have various conferences and a union that gave guidance and direction to the conferences. And instead of taking all of the problems to the General Conference that they needed to, the individual conferences could appeal to the union to work with them, and if they couldn't do it, then they could approach the General Conference. But this became much more effective. In the meantime, Ellen White continued to press for the relief for the denominational president. Now, I've already mentioned how there have already been a number of steps, but when you consider the size and the geographical immensity of a General Conference that covers the whole world field, and one man, even though he does have a general assistant and has several who is working with him, to channel us all in one spout is too much. And so there continued to be strong pleas for change. And Ellen White noticed the fact that the General Conference was not only the General Conference president, but he also was a president of the association, General Conference Association. He was a president of the publishing work. He was a president of the Tract Society, president of the Foreign Mission Board. How could anyone do justice to that? And how could anyone have all of those offices without exercising kingly power? It would seem as though he almost have to abandon the responsibilities or act in some way when problems came up. He was also the president of the Foreign Mission Board. And in 1897, Ellen White was so distressed because of the authority channeled in such few people that she expressed doubts that about the General Conference being the voice of God, as she had indicated before. And she demanded thorough reorganization, as was really being called for from the field as well. 1899, amongst the complaints of an inadequate denominational structure. One of the major voices was that of A.T. Jones, who criticized the system and called for repentance. He considered this a moral issue, and his focus was on kingly power. Now, you can understand that he was faced with a real problem. He was seeking the answer to a problem that needed to be resolved. However, as you will recall, Jones identified the problem with the title president and sought to get rid of the title president. It was not the title that was the problem, it was the organization that was the problem, together with the human tendency to control. In the meantime, J. Wagner called for sincere reform and a return to the 1888 message. And W. Prescott agreed with him and agreed with both and called for a centralizing trend. He called it a virtual despotism. These issues would have to be faced, and they were and would be faced in 1901. In the meantime, Ellen White returned from Australia. One of the key reasons she came back at that time was to be present at the General Conference time and to work toward a resolution of the organizational problems. Now, it's good for us to understand, young folk, that organizations don't operate themselves, and as an organization grows and develops, there have to be adjustments made in order for otherwise you're going to have kingly power. You have one person who has maybe 10 times or 20 times the responsibility, maybe more than was originally there. There have to be adaptations. In the evening, before the General Conference session in 1901, Ellen White called the officers of the different branches to come together for a special meeting, during which she spent an hour and a half urging the need for a thorough reorganization based on an equitable representation from all lines of work. And in that process, she made strong emphasis on that the Adventists have no kings. There should be no kings involved. Our organization should be such as to avoid anyone from having too much authority. And so when they met together the next morning, the president addressed the group a few words, and after he had spoken to them a little bit, he had said, well, the floor is open. In other words, he had referred to Ellen White's discussion the night before and the fact that there needed to be a reorganization. So he said, the floor is open for comments, for suggestions. At that point, A.G. Daniels came forward and took the floor. And when he did, he had specific things to present. First of all, he recommended that the North American divisions, which we have indicated, there are now 6 different divisions, but that these divisions should meet together and form union conferences. And those union conferences would replace the conferences as the basic building blocks of the General Conference. In other words, at this point, all the conference presidents were involved as the basic level of the General Conference. In other words, all of them were involved in the General Conference. Now, he suggests that they they come together and they unite as union conferences, and that each one of them would form a constitution of its own, and they would become an integral part of the General Conference. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the General Conference base is the unions. In other words, all union presidents become a part of the General Conference Committee. And what he suggested there was that the new executive committee have 25 members. Now remember, it had been increased from 3 to 5 and later from 5 to 7. Now he's suggesting that there should be a committee of 25, which is 18 more, great deal more than what they had, and that of these, 6 of these be chosen by the medical officers and by the medical work, and the other 19 be chosen by the General Conference in session. Then, as the new presidents and new unions might be formed, then each new union president would become a part of the General Conference Committee. So, this also, a part of his suggestion was that the enlarged body would replace all of the present boards and committees. One of the important parts that are not mentioned in the book, but an important factor in this, was not only the development of the Union Conference in Australia, which served as a model for the unions that we would develop worldwide, but there also had been a great deal of development in South Africa. The South Africans had gone ahead and done something different than they had before, and that is that the Sabbath School department, the Sabbath School became a department of the General Conference, or of the conference. The education became a department, and the various elements, publishing and so forth, became departments of the conference. Now before, they actually had their own boards, and they were acting semi-independently of the denomination. Now notice 2 things are happening. One is there's a unification, and the second is a diversification. The unification has to do with bringing all elements of Adventist work under one head, and the diversification is multiplying that head, that is, that body of overseers. So now you have unions and you have divisions. This would come later. The divisions was something that came into being when as they grew, but it would have to do with localized responsibility. In other words, the responsibility in this union would be carried by its own president, its own secretaries, and so forth, so that the General Conference would not have to deal with the local problems. And then the conferences had an appeal direct in their own fields. The union officers could help them with their specific problems. Well, the 1901 General Conference became a very great success and is a milestone in Adventist history. And I want you to have the sense of God's guidance. Ellen White testified that the angels of God were walking up and down the aisles at that time, and she said she was astonished at how God had led in the development of his work. And what this development was a development of priesthood and believer principles to permit priesthood principles to be carried out, so that it removes the authority from not only from any given committee, but from, in other words, not only just from an individual, but also from the committees and so forth. So you have scores of centers instead of one center. Can you imagine what would have happened to Adventism if this had not taken place? Now, there are a lot of people who are still today unhappy with organization, and there will always be organizational challenges. And as work grows, there will be, and there needs to be ways of dealing with that. But we need to remember that God led us in this organization so that we would be able to follow priesthood of believers more effectively. This was a republican form of government in which the local church is responsible for itself. Do you realize at the General Conference, if there was someone in a local church who was doing some bad things or, heretical or whatever, the General Conference president could not do any more about that than a member of the church. It is the church itself that handles that. It is only the church that can deal with that. Your membership is a membership in a particular church. How many of you know where your membership is? Do any of you not know? Well, you need to know where your membership is, and many people don't. They've lost track of where it was. They've moved here, and oftentimes fail to keep their membership current. Whenever you go from one place to another, one of the most important things you do is to have your membership transferred to where you are. If you're not a member of the local church, you have no right to vote. You have no voice in that church. Only a member of the Colfax Church, for instance, where I'm a member, only a member has a right. And if that person is a member there, they not only have a right, but a responsibility to attend any of the church's business meetings. Now, you won't be able to attend all the board meetings, and you are not expected to, but you are expected to deal with the business meetings. The local church is set up in such a way that we have a board, and that board is the operating has the operating responsibility for the church. But any major change, they are there to carry out what the church has told them to do. Any major change, the board cannot take. They can only recommend to the church in business session. And for instance, if there's someone whose membership is in question, no board can take action on that. But they do have the responsibility for examining the case and making a recommendation. But it is the church at large, as the whole church meets together, makes major decisions. Are we going to build? Are we going to do this? The major issues are always brought to the church. And the church sends its representatives to the conference. When the conference constituency meeting meets, what is the constituency? It's a combination of representatives from all of the churches. Every church has at least one representative, as small as it can be. You have at least one representative, and then you have additional representatives for each. I think it's a group of 50. However, the membership, large it is, will be sent to the conference. Now, who is it that decides on who the conference president, secretary, and treasurer? It's that constituency. It's the members from the local churches who decide that. And when that is decided, then that forms the conference executive officers and executive committee. And now when it comes to a union meeting, how do we decide who's going to be the union officers? It's the representatives from each of the conferences and also a smaller representative of members from local churches. This is a representative form of government so that anyone who has a burden can find someone close enough by who is going to be representing them to be able to share with them their concerns. So when it comes time for the General Conference, the same thing happens. We have representatives from the conference, from the union, and we also have some representatives. It's a much smaller group now, but we have representation from the churches. And all of those meet together and decide on the decision. One of the first decisions is the president, and then they decide on the other officers. Now, this is a sacred responsibility. This is an organization God has given to us. We have not adequately operated as a priesthood of believers because we haven't really understood and been involved. Now, I have shared with you, and am sharing with you, the important responsibilities that you have as members of the church. It is not just your privilege to be involved, it is your duty to be involved. And as we take seriously this duty, and the time will come when you may be a representative of the conference, or even to the union someday, or the General Conference. But at any rate, it's a serious thing, and you are there to represent the church or group, the conference or whatever it is, that you are sent by. And if this is carried out appropriately, it becomes a very effective means of maintaining the organization that God has given to us. Now, should there be changes? Yes, there probably need to be some changes as the organization grows. There need to be some new things added there and so forth, but we should never move away from the pattern of organization that God has given us. There are voices in this organization that are earnestly contending for more of a I can't get the right word right now, but anyway, so that each church is more independent. God has given us a program that allows a church to have sufficient independence, but is urgent that we maintain our interdependence. And as time goes on, you'll be subject to various voices. But remember that the plan that God has for us is one which keeps us together and yet allows us individually to have a great deal of freedom. Coming back to the local church is the only one who can decide local issues. No other conference can't do that. Now, the only input the conference has is the conference is responsible to provide ministers for the churches. But even that, the conferences in today, as far as I know, the ones that I know about, have been following a plan that was not existent when I first became a pastor. And that is, they consult with the local churches before appointing a pastor. There was a time when the conference committee would sit down and say, well, send this pastor here, that one there, and the other one here. Now, that is not done in the conferences that I know about, and probably more or less throughout the field. But what happens is that the ministerial secretary or someone goes to the church, sit down with them, and spend some time negotiating with them as to a pastor, so that they even have a voice in who will pastor them. You may or may not know, but recently we have had a new pastor appointed to Colfax and to Meta Vista. And the decision was made to bring Colfax and Meta Vista back into one district, which was when I first came here, and then it was changed, and they've now brought it back. And so we have Brother Kevin Doe is now our pastor. But both churches were directly involved, extensively involved in the discussions, and it was the churches themselves who voted to ask Pastor Kevin to become their pastor. Well, it is now within a minute of time for us to close. Shall we bow our heads? Father, thank you so much for your many blessings. I pray that you will guide and direct us, and especially that we may never forget the importance of priesthood of believers, and that you will help us to cooperate fully in the representative form of government that you have given to us. We ask in the name of Jesus. Amen.